Hello, welcome to Calumet Roundtable, a student-produced program at Purdue Northwest. I'm your host, Lee Artz, from the Department of Communication. I'm delighted today to have as my guest Medea Benjamin. We're going to be talking about her new book, which is Kingdom of the Unjust, the U.S.-Saudi Connection. Medea is the founder of Code Pink, which is an anti-war organization that was founded shortly after 9/11, and I would like to talk about that a bit, so welcome.
Thank you, Lee. Nice to be on the show.
Why don't we begin just a little bit with a background. You're wearing the shirt Code Pink, and we want to assure our viewers that it's not a Victoria's Secret ad. So what does Code Pink, Women for Peace? Can you give us a little background on that?
Yes, it's a group that came together in 2002 after the 9/11 attacks, when we heard the U.S. was about to go to war in Iraq, and we said, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, why are we doing this? And we knew about the color-coded alert system the Bush administration had, the yellow, orange, red, and we said, let's have another color code, Code Pink, to say, let's go after the individuals who attacked us, but not use it as an excuse to invade another country, Iraq. Boy, were we right.
I have a vague memory of people from Code Pink. Was it at Congress, or was there some other hearing that you were at that would have been televised nationally? Or was this when you met with Hillary Clinton? I'm not sure.
No, you're right. Our first action was when Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, was going to appear before Congress to talk about why we should invade Iraq. And we had just come back from Iraq. Okay. And we said, we got to get to that hearing. I flew in from San Francisco. My colleague flew in from Texas. We'd never been to a hearing before. We didn't even know it was open to the public. We pretended we were journalists. We got our pantsuits, and we got those long, memo pads, and we put a Washington Post under our arm, and we went in and it turned out it was not only open to the public, there was nobody else there. And they said, ladies, go in, you can sit right behind the generals. And there we were behind a line of generals. We had put banners in our pantsuit. And as soon as Donald Rumsfeld started talking about why we had to invade Iraq, we jumped up, we took out our banners, and it said, UN inspectors, not US war. And we started saying, how much money are Halliburton going to make from this war? How many US soldiers are going to die? Why are we invading a country that had nothing to do with 9/11? And they dragged us out, but we were on every single show, every TV. We were the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post. Not only that, from all over the world, we were on the cover. And we realized that there was a lot of yearning to see Americans standing up to George Bush in this war. And out of that, Code Pink just grew like, wildfire.
We want to talk about the book, which is about Saudi Arabia, but I started with that because there seems to be some connection between 9/11 and then the U.S. Invasion, occupation of Iraq, and then kind of where we are today with Syria and the rest. But one of the things that you mentioned was you said you had been in Iraq before the war. And I think that's important because American people, right, we read the press, we see it, the justification is given, but we don't necessarily know weapons of mass destruction. Can you tell us just briefly about what happened when you were there and who you spoke to?
Yeah, we went because we said, if our government's going to invade this country because they say there's weapons of mass destruction, let's go there ourselves and see what the people there say. We met with the weapons inspectors who said, there are no weapons of mass destruction.
The United Nations weapons.
The United Nations. They said, everybody here knows that. It's just a big lie. And they would go out every morning, quote, looking for weapons of mass destruction. They said, there aren't any. And so we came back yelling and screaming in our Congress saying, hey, you all know it's a big lie. There are no weapons of mass destruction. And people knew it. They just wanted to use the people who wanted us to go to war, George Bush, his neocon friends, they were just using this as a pretext. There weren't weapons of mass destruction.
We like to present a balanced show here. So I would also point out that Hillary Clinton wanted to go to war.
She sure did.
Why don't you tell us a bit about when Code Pink visited her?
Oh, we were so frustrated. We went to her and we said, we were just in Iraq. There are no weapons of mass destruction. And she said, I don't care. Saddam Hussein is a dictator and I have to protect the people of New York, and so I'm voting for this war. So yes, there were Democrats, there were Republicans, and they were doing it for political calculations, what they thought the US people might want. but it was such a bad decision, and we see the results of it today with ISIS and, you know, the longest wars we've ever been in, Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, most of the students here at Purdue have not lived a day of their lives where there hasn't been U.S. involved in war.
So sad, it shouldn't be like that.
Which is where we are today. Let's move a little bit to the book. We can kind of go back and forth with Code Pink and some of the other experiences. But you wrote this book, The Connection Between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And recently it's been in the news that the families of 9/11 were petitioning, asking for the right to sue the Saudis. Why was there such a reluctance by the U.S. government? And I think that probably is featured in your book as well. Why is there such a reluctance by the U.S. government to have any kind of criticism with a Saudi government?
There has been this long-standing relationship between our government, whether Democrat or Republican administration, to be allies of the Saudis from the time that oil was discovered in the 1930s. We have tolerated what Saudi Arabia has done internally and externally on the basis that, well, we need to be able to get their oil. And more recently, we've been selling massive amount of weapons to Saudi Arabia, so they are our #1 weapons purchaser, and the weapons industry is very strong in this country. So for a number of reasons, we find ourselves in alliance with the country that is most responsible for spreading extremism around the world.
That's a bold claim. And you write about
I back it up.
Well, you write about it in the book. Maybe you could give us some, I mean,
Don't believe me, Lee.
Okay.
Believe the WikiLeaks cables coming from high officials in the U.S. government, including Hillary Clinton, that says, what are we going to do about our allies? They're funding Al-Qaeda, they're funding the Taliban, they're funding ISIS. They are funding extremist groups around the world.
So you're saying there's evidence that the Saudi government is funding Al-Qaeda and funding ISIS, and this is a matter of record that someone could find? I mean,
yes,
could read your book.
And they funded in the beginning. They fund them, for example, the U.S. helped to fund Osama bin Laden to create the Mujahideen, to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. That turned into Al-Qaeda. The Soviets, for a while, supported Al-Qaeda. It's like the Frankenstein baby that's created by, oftentimes, the US CIA and the Saudis, and then it takes on a life of its own, like Al-Qaeda has, like ISIS has, and can't be controlled anymore.
Again, that kind of contradicts what the average American's going to see on TV, or when you read the paper, you're going to see a vision of a Saudi king, which kind of looks like the Sultan in Disney's Aladdin, and they're all cheerful and they're in their shiny cars, and it seems fairly mundane. In fact, Obama had talked recently about the modernizing influence of the new Saudi prince that just became the head of Saudi. How is that possible, what you're saying, and the visions that the presentations that we get?
Well, first of all, Obama has also said in interviews that he doesn't like having this relationship with Saudi Arabia, having to okay the things that they do, and they should learn to share the region with Iran, something that the Saudis were very upset when they heard Obama say. Obama did negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, which the Saudis were vehemently against. But on the other hand, because of this long-standing relationship, because of, quote, the need for stable allies in the region, it keeps going.
Why does Saudi have to be the most stable ally? Why wouldn't some other country like Jordan?
Because they have oil, Lee.
Okay.
Because they have oil and they have money, and they use that money to buy influence, and they buy up hundreds of billions of dollars of real estate in the United States and oil refineries, and they invested $3.5 billion in Uber and got a seat on the Uber board.
Are you serious?
Serious.
So
in a country where half the population can't drive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which half?
The women. Exactly.
So when I call up for Uber, I'm contributing to a Saudi investor.
Every time you get in the back seat of the Uber, think the women have to be in the back seat in Saudi Arabia.
So the connection isn't like somewhere far off in the desert, but it's here in the United States with Uber. And I happen to know, because I teach media studies, that the royal family also has major investments in Disney and several other of our major media companies. But I would not call that some kind of plot or something to influence the American public, even though there may be PR groups that work for Saudi Arabia. The thing that concerns me the most, and I would think would concern most Americans, is the knowledge, if it's true that the U.S. government knows this, the continued support to a monarchy. I mean, that's something we had the American Revolution about. So
and it's
it just
not
seems
just
so
a monarchy. There are
contradictory.
many monarchies. There are about 30-something monarchies that exist in the world, but they're constitutional monarchies. You have a constitution, you have a democratic process, and you
mean
might have
like
a
the Queen of
king-queen like
England?
England.
Okay.
Yeah. So, let the Saudis have their king and queen,
right.
but let's have a constitution,
They
let's
have
have
no constitution. They
elections.
have
There's
no
no constitution, there's no parliament, there's no assembly, there's no Congress, there's no elections for any national office.
I would assume that this is difficult for most of our viewers to just comprehend. It just seems like something out of a fictional fantasy universe where you have the most powerful country arguably now outside of Egypt and Israel in the Mideast is Saudi Arabia, and at the same time you're saying that there's no semblance of democracy.
No semblance of democracy, period. No
US
freedom of
is-
speech, assembly, religion, no political parties, no unions. People put to death by beheading for nonviolent things like spreading atheism or insulting the kingdom.
So you're saying Saudi Arabia beheads people?
They behead people.
Why don't we see that on television? We've seen ISIS beheading people. Why don't we see Saudis? If Saudi's doing it, why wouldn't the New York Times or ABC News cover this?
They used to do it publicly in public squares, except now they've become more embarrassed to have the world know about it. So oftentimes it's not in public squares anymore. But you're the communications person. There's a lot of PR firms in the U.S. that are paid for by the Saudi government to put the best light on the Saudi government, and I think public beheadings are probably not the best light.
Well, I'll have to read, I read some of the book, but I'll have to read that chapter in the book about which are the PR firms in the U.S. that are doing the work for Saudi Arabia. We have to take a short break to thank our students for doing this work at the Calumet Roundtable. We'll be right back. I want to talk a little bit about Saudi's role in Yemen and also talk some more about the connection with the U.S. current foreign policy. So we'll be right back. Welcome back to Calumet Roundtable, a student-produced interview program that's done right here in the studios of Purdue Northwest. I'm your host, Lee Artz, and my guest today is Medea Benjamin from Code Pink and Global Exchange. I need to reveal that we did a Global Exchange tour with our Purdue students just a few years ago. We did a tour of the media in Venezuela, and it was very successful. So I want to thank you for Global Exchange. I've known of your work in another capacity. But I wanted to return, just to kind of close out the one brief thing that we talked about right before the break, which was Saudi Arabia having public relations firms that are active in the U.S. to kind of influence and encourage a certain kind of coverage. And so I wanted to see if you could give an example or two, a concrete example or two.
Well, the Saudis hedge their bets, so they get both Republicans and Democrats, oftentimes PR firms that have former senators, former congresspeople, former people high up in the military. There's one group, the Podesta group, that John Podesta.
He's the Hillary Clinton's.
The chairperson of her campaign.
He has a PR firm.
He has a PR firm with his brother, Tony Podesta.
Okay.
And John went off to run Hillary's campaign, and meanwhile, Tony became a paid, registered foreign agent for the Saudi government, getting $140,000 every month from the Saudis.
To do PR.
To do PR.
Okay. I don't want to imply that this means that that this program or you or I support the Republican public relations firms. So
it's bipartisan, and just like Hillary Clinton's foundation took $10 to $25 million from the Saudis, so did John McCain's foundation take millions
All right,
from
good.
the Saudis.
We've kind of checked off each box. On a more serious note, although that's obviously very serious, because the news and the information we get is always influenced by how journalists respond to a story pitch or a public relations pitch from multiple firms, not just on foreign relations. But one of those that has appeared slightly in the news, but probably not as prominently as you would think, given the amount of coverage that's gone to Syria, is the Saudi war in Yemen. And if we're talking about the Saudi-U.S. connection, could you talk a little bit about the Saudi operation and the U.S. role in that operation in Yemen?
Yes, well, the Saudis were worried about a civil strife inside of Yemen. They thought that one of the factions, the Houthis, who were closer to Iran, would give Iran a foothold next door. And they said, you know, we'll go in, quick, throw a couple of bombs, get rid of them, put our person in. It hasn't worked out like that. It's been 19 months now with constant Saudi bombardment, and Yemen has no oil. Yemen is a very poor country, and now it's been devastated by this bombing campaign with the Saudis hitting schools and hospitals and clinics and residential neighborhoods and weddings and funerals, destroying infrastructure. There's now an outbreak of cholera because of lack of clean water and lack of clinics. It's a catastrophic situation, and the U.S. is very responsible for it. This could not happen without U.S. support. Not only supplying the weapons, but refueling the airplanes in the air, providing maintenance to all of the weapons systems, giving logistical support, intelligence support, diplomatic cover. This is seen as a U.S. war.
I see that word all the time. Sometimes I see it in commercials. Logistical is kind of one of these words that disguises a lot. Does that mean logistical support? Does that mean here's the coordinate of where to drop the bomb?
Well, yes, and when the Saudis have been dropping the bombs in all these residential and civilian places, the U.S. says, okay, now we're going to pull out our people. We're not going to, we were providing this information because we thought it would help save lives, because we would help pinpoint. But obviously,
smart bombs.
Yeah, the smart bombs. Obviously, that hasn't helped. A third of the bombs have hit civilian targets. The U.S. says it's going to be less involved now, but still we are refueling the planes. We are providing all the munitions. We were, until very recently, even providing banned weapons like cluster bombs. We're even providing white phosphorus that has been used against civilians totally illegally.
The U.S. The military or private companies are selling it? How does it get there?
Private companies are selling it, authorized by the White House, rubber stamped by the Congress, and then used by the Saudis in Yemen.
Again, this is an amazing thing, I think, for any of our viewers or any American citizens. And my read on it is not so much that the Houthis or Yemen was close to Iran, but it was more the fact that the Houthis had removed a government that they didn't like, and on the border of Saudi Arabia, just as in Syria or Tunis, the fact that there could be a mass movement that wins democracy or wins some semblance of social change is probably more threatening to Saudi, the kingdom, than Iran ever would be. And in that sense, Yemen posed a threat, kind of like a good example or the possibility of, I don't know how you would respond.
Except the Houthis came in armed, and I don't think that is the same thing as a democratic, grassroots, nonviolent uprising.
Okay. If we move a little bit, it seems that the way that we read about the Mideast, including Saudi Arabia or Yemen or Syria or the rest of these external threats, to some extent Iran, again, in most of the press, it's Russia, Putin, right? It's like there's this dangerous threat. How does that enter into the calculation that the U.S. makes for its connection with Saudi Arabia? Where does the Russian connection or the Russian threat enter into whatever alliance has to be made with Saudi?
Well, it's like now there are these proxy wars being played out between Saudi and their nemesis, Iran, between then the US that sides with the Saudis and the Russians that are siding with Iran. And so you see this played out not only in Syria, you see it played out in Iraq, in Libya, to some extent even in Lebanon. And so it's very dangerous because, especially in Syria, where the Saudis have been supporting the extremist rebels, some of them affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and the US then says, no, we're not going to support you to fund the extremist ones, but the extremists and the more moderate ones are all working together. You can't separate them. And it puts the US on this collision course, not only with the Syrian government, but with Russia, which is very, very dangerous.
It seems exceedingly dangerous, particularly because both of the candidates running for office have talked about increased muscular presence of the U.S. inside the Syrian conflict.
Which would only make things even worse than they are now.
Well, here's a question, right? There is an ISIS. I mean, that's not a creation of some journalist or the CBS News or Fox News. There is ISIS.
Yes, I would say it's a creation of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the Saudi funding.
And someone might say, okay, that's true, but they're still attacking, and the only way to resist that, it's not like you can reason with ISIS. They cut off people's heads. We can't take them to a negotiating table because they want to have a caliphate. So what other option is there except to have an armed resistance of some sort? I mean, how is that? Okay, yes, it was created. Yes, it's responsible. It falls at the feet of George Bush or Obama or the king of Saudi Arabia, but it's there, and we can deal with that later. The first thing you have to do is stop ISIS, and to stop ISIS, because they can't be reasoned with, you have to have this more robust military response.
I would say as an outside power that is not threatened by ISIS, our job is to stop the flow of weapons to the region, including the weapons that have been flowing in from Turkey to ISIS.
So
stop
ISIS
the
isn't
flow.
making its own weapons.
No, they're not making their own weapons.
Okay.
Stop the flow of resources that have been coming in from Turkey into ISIS. Stop the outside intervention in Syria in general. And there are plenty of groups in the region, like the Kurds, who are fighting ISIS better than anybody else is, yes. But they've been distracted by all the other fighting that's going on against Assad instead of people focusing on ISIS.
It sounds a lot like we've come back to where one of your earlier revelations of an American citizen about the need for citizen involvement or public response to these things. Because when you say stop the flow of arms, stop the support of this, it sounds like you're saying the U.S. government has to have a different policy. But that's not going to come from the candidates that are running for office now, or it's not going to come from the people that are set. So where is it going to come from?
Right, that's something that has to come from the grassroots. I mean, we know the sentiment. The American people are tired of war. It's been 15 years, the longest wars in our history. And Americans don't want U.S. soldiers going to the Middle East anymore. And those who are supporting a no-fly zone in Syria, the generals say that implies having U.S. troops on the ground. I think there needs to be a rising up from the grassroots in the United States to say, we want our resources to build our economy back up at home. We want our military to defend us back at home. We want to address the real crises like the climate crises that are happening. These are the things that we need to shift resources, attention, energy, and get ourselves out of the Middle East.
And I will agree with you, and I would assume large numbers of Americans would. But the question is, how does that happen? What has to kind of, okay, I like it, now what do we do? I mean, do I sign a paper? What do I do?
You can go to codepink.org and check us out and sign up. During the Bush years, we had massive demonstrations in the streets. We had millions of people who came out in the streets. We need to build that up again. We need a real movement that can mobilize people, that can do sit-ins in our congressional offices, that can do die-ins in front of the White House, that can say, no more war.
Is there evidence to suggest that that's effective?
Yes, it's always been effective. People's movements might take a while, but they're effective in the end. It's the only thing that changes history. And unfortunately, I think with the next person in the White House, there's going to be more militaristic policy, and people are going to feel more compelled to come out on the streets. We got to be there to organize people and to be effective.
And do you put that in your book? I mean, is that part of the, is there a conclusion in the book that doesn't just, like an academic book will say, well, here's the description of the relations. Is that part of what you argue for in the book?
Yeah, that's why I write books, is to be a tool for action, to get people educated and then to get them inspired, to make them feel that they can be part of movements that can change history, that it's not all doom and gloom, that there is something good at the end to work for, and that is a more peaceful world with a foreign policy that uses our resources to provide clean drinking water and clinics and lift people out of poverty and appreciate this beautiful, diverse world we live in instead of going around and killing people.
That's a wonderful closing, and I think that it kind of balances what you did with the book, because the book presents a crisp, clear picture of the Saudi-U.S. relation, which is not something someone should be proud of, but it provides plenty of empirical evidence and examples, which should encourage what you're asking people to do. So again, I want to thank you for joining us today. I wish you well on the rest of your tour, and if you're ever in the region again, we'll welcome you back, and hopefully we'll take some more Purdue students on a global exchange tour to different parts of the world.
Come to Washington, D.C. We need you there.
Okay. That's all the time we have on our program. Thank you, Medea, for joining me today on Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Artz. Have a great day. Thank you, everybody.